The first-class cabin was a sanctuary of quiet luxury. The soft hum of the engines created a gentle white noise, blending seamlessly with the occasional rustle of newspapers and the delicate clink of crystal glasses being set down by flight attendants. Plush leather seats, the color of deep mahogany, stretched out into personal pods, each an oasis of exclusivity. The scent of fresh espresso mingled with the faint notes of designer colognes, a sensory reminder that this was not just a flight, it was an experience for those who had made it. Richard Calloway certainly believed he belonged here. Dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, the fabric whispering wealth with every slight movement, he leaned back in his seat with the casual arrogance of a man who had spent his life winning. His gold cufflinks gleamed under the ambient lighting, and his polished leather shoes rested comfortably, crossed at the ankles, as if the very air in first class was meant to accommodate his presence. He glanced at his Rolex. Boarding had taken too long. He hated inefficiency, and even in first class, he found things to complain about. The service was excellent, of course, but Richard Calloway was the type of man who believed excellence was merely the baseline for his standards. As he swirled the deep amber liquid in his glass, bourbon, aged 25 years, the only thing he deemed worthy of drinking on a flight, he barely noticed the man settling into the seat beside him. At first, it was just a blur of movement in his peripheral vision. But then, something about this particular passenger made him glance sideways. The man was dressed in a simple black hoodie, the kind you'd expect to see in a coffee shop, not first class. His jeans, were slightly worn, and his black boots had scuff marks along the soles. Unlike the other passengers in their tailored suits and designer dresses, this man looked almost casual, Richard's brow furrowed. It wasn't just the clothing, it was the way he carried himself. There was no entitled air about him, no practiced indifference that most first-class passengers wore like armor. Instead, he exuded something entirely different, calm, quiet confidence, as though he were completely at ease despite standing out. Richard scoffed under his breath. Looks like they'll let just anyone in first class these days. The words were meant to be quiet, muttered just loud enough for the man to hear, but not loud enough to be a direct challenge. A test, perhaps, to see if this casually dressed stranger knew his place. The man turned slightly, offering a small, polite nod, but said nothing. There was no anger in his expression, no flustered reaction, no attempt to prove himself. If anything, there was something knowing in his eyes, as if he had encountered men like Richard before. Richard expected some kind of response, a nervous chuckle, a stammered excuse. Even irritation would have been better than this silent, unwavering indifference. His fingers tapped idly against the armrest. Seriously, he continued, his voice carrying more weight now, loud enough that a few nearby passengers subtly glanced over. I mean, did you win a ticket? In some contest or something? He chuckled, sipping his bourbon. No offense, buddy, but you don't exactly belong here. The man turned his gaze back to the window, watching the vast expanse of clouds stretching endlessly below them. He exhaled slowly, as if he had heard the insult, but simply didn't find it worth acknowledging. Richard frowned. That reaction wasn't what he had expected. Most people, especially those who didn't belong in his world, would have either tried to defend themselves or shrunk under his words. This man did neither. Annoyed by the lack of reaction, Richard shifted in his seat, making a show of adjusting his cuffs and stretching his legs out slightly. You know, he added, swirling his bourbon once more, first class isn't just about a seat. It's about the experience, the exclusivity. It's for people who understand what it means to earn their place. Still, The man beside him didn't take the bait. He simply leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed, unconcerned. There was something profoundly irritating about that. Richard was used to commanding attention. When he spoke, people listened. When he dismissed someone, they felt dismissed. That was the natural order of things. He had built his career on that dynamic. Dominating boardrooms, cutting deals that made men sweat in their expensive suits, dictating who rose and who fell in the ruthless world of high finance. But this man? This nobody in a hoodie? He wasn't playing the game. A flight attendant approached, her presence momentarily cutting through Richard's growing irritation. She was young, poised, and professional, her uniform crisp, her red lipstick applied with military precision. She held a tray, her expression warm as she turned toward the man Richard had been quietly ridiculing. "Mr. Reeves," she said with genuine respect, "can I get you anything?" Richard's grip on his glass tightened. "Mr. Reeves?" The name rang in his ears like an alarm. He turned his head sharply, his gaze snapping to the man beside him, taking in the casual clothing, the quiet demeanor, the slight, almost amused smile on his lips. Realization hit him like a freight train. Keanu Reeves. Richard felt his stomach drop. The John Wick guy. The Matrix legend. The Hollywood superstar known not just for his iconic roles, but for something even rarer among celebrities. His humility. His kindness. The very same man he had just spent the last 10 minutes mocking. Keanu Reeves, who had once given up his subway seat for a stranger without hesitation. Keanu Reeves, who had reportedly donated most of his earnings, from the Matrix, to the crew and stunt teams. Keanu Reeves, who had been praised countless times for his generosity, his quiet demeanor, his respect for people from all walks of life. And Richard Calloway, millionaire, hedge fund tycoon, self-proclaimed master of the universe, had just tried to put him down. His mouth suddenly felt dry. Keanu glanced at the flight attendant with a small, humble smile. "Just a water, please." The attendant beamed. "Of course. And I just want to say, I really admire everything you do. You're an incredible human being." Keanu gave a soft chuckle, dipping his head slightly as if embarrassed by the praise. "That's really kind of you." Thank you. Richard's smirk, the one he had worn so effortlessly minutes ago, had vanished. He felt his face flush with heat. The other passengers, who had overheard his earlier remarks, now exchanged knowing glances. He could feel the judgment in their eyes, the quiet disapproval. His earlier arrogance had been on full display, and now he looked like a fool. His mind scrambled for a way to recover, to undo what had just happened. Maybe he could laugh it off. Maybe he could pretend he had known all along. But deep down, Richard knew the truth. He had revealed exactly who he was, and Keanu Reeves had revealed exactly who he was. For the first time in years, Richard Calloway felt small. A thick silence hung in the air, palpable and heavy. Richard Calloway, once comfortably basking in his perceived superiority, now found himself shrinking under the weight of his own words. The realization of who sat beside him had flipped the entire dynamic of the flight. Keanu Reeves. The name itself carried a gravity Richard could no longer ignore. This wasn't just some random guy in a hoodie who had somehow lucked into a first-class seat. This was one of the most beloved actors in the world, a man whose reputation wasn't built on scandal, wealth, or arrogance, but on kindness, humility, and quiet dignity. Richard swallowed, trying to recover. He prided himself on his ability to read the room, to adapt, to win no matter the situation. But how did one win against this? His mind worked frantically, searching for something, anything, to say that could smooth over the interaction. Maybe a joke? A casual, "Oh, I was just messing around," delivered with a chuckle. But somehow, he knew that wouldn't work. Keanu was watching him now, not with anger or even amusement, but with something far more unsettling: understanding. The actor's dark eyes were calm, as if he had witnessed this kind of behavior before. As if men like Richard, who measured worth in wealth and status, were nothing new to him. And yet, there was no condescension, no smugness, no satisfaction in watching Richard squirm, just quiet patience, like a teacher waiting for a student to realize their mistake. The flight attendant returned with a glass of water, placing it gently on Keanu's tray. "Here you go, Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice still laced with admiration. "Thank you," Keanu said, with an appreciative nod. He reached for the glass, his movements unhurried and graceful, as if completely at peace with his surroundings. Richard watched the exchange closely. There was something disarming about the way Keanu carried himself. There was no pretense, no ego. He didn't demand respect. He simply commanded it, through his actions, through the way he treated people. The flight attendant lingered for a second longer, almost hesitant to leave, as if savoring the brief interaction with someone she truly admired. Then, with a final smile, she moved down the aisle to tend to the other passengers. Richard cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "So, you're the Keanu Reeves, huh?" Keanu chuckled lightly, his gaze still fixed on the clouds outside. "Something like that." Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing a grin. "Well, damn. That's wild." Keanu finally turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. "Is it?" Richard hesitated. The response was simple, but something about it unsettled him. It wasn't an ego-driven remark. It was just a question, as if Keanu was gently pushing him to think about why he found it so shocking. "I mean, yeah," Richard said, still attempting to reclaim his composure. You don't act like a movie star." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. "How do movie stars act?" Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. How did they act? He had been in rooms with billionaires, corporate moguls, and celebrities before. Most carried themselves with a kind of entitlement, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were above the ordinary. But Keanu? He was the complete opposite. Richard let out an awkward chuckle. "I guess I just expected something different." Keanu nodded slightly, taking a slow sip of his water. "Expectations can be tricky." Richard frowned, feeling the sting of those words more than he cared to admit. He had spent his life making snap judgments about people, about their worth, their status, their place in the hierarchy of the world. He had built an empire on reading people's strengths and weaknesses in an instant, exploiting vulnerabilities for his own gain. And yet, sitting here now, he realized how completely wrong his instincts had been about the man next to him. The flight continued in silence for a few minutes, but the energy between them had shifted. Richard wasn't sure why, but he felt the need to say something, to fill the space with words, even if they didn't mean anything. "So, first class, huh?" He forced a chuckle. "Not bad, right?" Keanu smiled slightly. "It's nice." "You fly like this all the time?" Keanu shook his head. "Not always." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Wait, you mean you choose not to fly first class?" Keanu nodded, setting his glass down. "I take the subway when I can. Economy class when it makes sense. First class is great, but it's not necessary." Richard stared at him. The concept was so foreign, it almost sounded absurd. A man worth millions, maybe even hundreds of millions, and he still took the subway? He still sat in cramped economy seats with the rest of the world? "Why?" Richard blurted before he could stop himself. Keanu looked at him, and for the first time, Richard saw something flicker in his expression. A memory, perhaps. A thought that carried more weight than the words that followed. Because money doesn't change who you are, Keanu said simply. It just gives you more choices. Richard swallowed hard. For a man who had spent his entire life believing the opposite, that wealth was identity, that power defined a person, those words landed like a punch to the gut. The conversation was interrupted by a voice from across the aisle. "Oh, Mr. Reeves," an older woman said, leaning forward slightly, "I have to say, I read that story about you giving up your seat on the subway for a stranger. That was just so wonderful." Keanu turned to her, his face lighting up with a genuine smile. "That's just basic kindness." The woman beamed, clearly delighted to have his attention. "Well, I just think the world needs more people like you." Another passenger, a man in his 30s, chimed in. "And what about that time you donated millions to children's hospitals? That's not basic kindness. That's extraordinary." Keanu's expression softened. "I just try to help where I can." Richard sat frozen in his seat. Millions to children's hospitals? Richard had spent his career accumulating wealth, hoarding it, treating it like a weapon to assert dominance over others. He had always viewed charity as a tax break, a strategic move rather than a genuine act of generosity. And here was Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world, casually brushing off millions in donations as if they were just another small way to make a difference. The flight attendant, returning to check on them, smiled at Keanu once more. "And I just loved the story about how you secretly funded your stunt crew's families after The Matrix. That must have meant the world to them." Richard felt his stomach drop. Keanu had done all of that, without bragging, without expecting recognition, without using it as a PR stunt. He had been wrong about him, painfully, humiliatingly wrong. And for the first time in years, Richard Calloway felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Regret. The weight of realization pressed down on Richard like an anchor. For years, he had believed in a single truth. Power was everything. Money, influence, status. Those were the currencies of the world. If you had them, you mattered. If you didn't, you were irrelevant. That belief had shaped every decision he had ever made, every interaction, every deal. And yet, sitting here, watching the way people revered Keanu Reeves, not because of his wealth, but because of his kindness, Richard felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Doubt. He had been so sure of himself when he boarded this flight, so comfortable in his own superiority. But now he felt small. He shifted in his seat, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. The silence between him and Keanu had stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, but for the first time, Richard wasn't sure how to break it. What could he even say? "Listen," he started, his voice quieter than before. "About earlier." Keanu turned to him, his expression unreadable but patient. Richard exhaled sharply, forcing himself to look at the man he had so casually insulted not long ago. I didn't realize who you were." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Would it have mattered?" Richard blinked. "What?" "If I wasn't me," Keanu continued, his voice calm, "would it have changed anything?" Richard opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. Would it have mattered? He knew the answer. If the man beside him had been just some nobody in a hoodie, Richard wouldn't have thought twice about dismissing him. He would have written him off as unimportant. That realization hit harder than he expected. He hesitated, then let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, I guess it would have." Keanu didn't look surprised. He simply nodded, as if he had seen this kind of revelation unfold before. Richard shifted again, suddenly uncomfortable in the plush leather seat that had once felt so luxurious. He looked down at the bourbon in his hand, swirling it absent-mindedly. The rich, amber liquid had been a comfort earlier, a symbol of status, of belonging. Now it felt meaningless. I've spent my whole life believing that wealth is what defines a person, he admitted, his voice lower now, almost reluctant. That if you don't look the part, if you don't act the part, then you don't belong. Keanu didn't interrupt. He simply listened. Richard let out a slow breath. I was wrong, wasn't I? Keanu gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. What do you think? Richard let out a dry laugh. I think I just made an ass of myself in front of one of the most respected people on the planet. Keanu chuckled. We all have moments like that. Richard studied him for a moment. There was no smugness in Keanu's expression, no desire to make him feel worse than he already did. If anything, he seemed understanding. That made it worse somehow. Richard had spent years surrounded by men like himself, ruthless, power-hungry, willing to crush anyone in their way. They never hesitated to humiliate those beneath them, to remind the world of their superiority. If the roles had been reversed, if he had been in Keanu's position, he would have made sure the other person felt their mistake. But Keanu, he just let it go. Richard cleared his throat. You know, I read about you once. Keanu raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Richard leaned back slightly, running a hand over his face. Some article about how you gave away most of your Matrix earnings to the special effects and stunt teams. Keanu simply shrugged. They deserved it. Richard stared at him. Most people wouldn't do that. Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. Most people don't realize how much they already have. Richard let that sink in. Here was a man who had every reason to bask in his own greatness, to demand recognition for his generosity. And yet, he sat here, in first class, drinking nothing but water, dressed in the kind of clothes that would have made Richard dismiss him instantly. It wasn't an act. It wasn't a performance. It was just who he was. The turbulence of Richard's thoughts was interrupted by a voice from behind them. Excuse me, Mr. Reeves? A young boy, no older than 10, stood in the aisle clutching a well-worn notebook. His mother hovered a few steps behind, offering an apologetic smile. Keanu turned to the boy, his expression softening. Hey there. The boy's hands trembled as he held out his notebook. I'm a huge fan. You're my favorite actor ever. Keanu's smile widened. That's really kind of you to say. The boy swallowed nervously. Would you mind signing this? Keanu reached out, carefully taking the notebook as if it were something precious. He flipped to a blank page and pulled a pen from his pocket. What's your name? Liam. Keanu nodded, writing a short message before handing the notebook back. There you go, Liam. Liam looked down at the signature, his face lighting up with pure joy. Thank you so much, Keanu chuckled. Anytime. The boy's mother placed a hand on his shoulder. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. You have no idea what this means to him. Keanu dipped his head respectfully. It's my pleasure. As the boy and his mother walked back to their seats, Richard found himself staring at the interaction, something tightening in his chest. Keanu had treated that kid like he mattered, like he wasn't just another fan, but a person. Richard realized, with an almost painful clarity, that this was why people loved Keanu Reeves. Not because of his movies, not because of his fame, because he saw people. And Richard had spent his entire life doing the opposite. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. How do you do it? Keanu turned back to him, raising an eyebrow. Do what? Richard gestured vaguely. Stay this decent. You're one of the most famous guys in the world. You could act like a total jerk, and people would still worship you. How do you not let it go to your head? Keanu considered that for a moment. Then he simply said, "I know what it's like to have nothing." Richard stiffened. "I've lost people I love," Keanu continued, his voice quiet but steady. "I've seen how fast life can change. None of this—" He gestured to the luxury of first class, to the world of wealth and privilege they sat in. "None of it lasts forever. So I try to be grateful, and I try to be kind." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. For the first time in his life, he envied someone, not for their money, or their power, or their success, but for something he had never valued before: their character. And that realization changed everything. Richard sat in silence, staring at the ice melting in his glass of bourbon. Keanu's words lingered in his mind, echoing with an unsettling clarity. "I know what it's like to have nothing. None of this lasts forever. So I try to be grateful, and I try to be kind." Richard had spent his entire life believing the opposite. He had clawed his way to the top, convinced that wealth was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that kept a person from being nothing. But here was a man who had everything: fame, fortune, admiration, who spoke about loss and impermanence as if they were inevitable, as if money couldn't shield him from them. And maybe it couldn't. Richard exhaled sharply, suddenly feeling like a fraud in his own skin. He prided himself on control, on being the one who dictated the rules, the one who commanded attention. But here, in this conversation, he was losing ground. No, he had already lost it. Keanu wasn't trying to humble him, and that was what made it worse. The actor wasn't boasting about his generosity or his tragedies. He wasn't lecturing Richard about morality or passing judgment on his behavior. He was simply being himself, and Richard hated how much that rattled him. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence between them. The other passengers had settled into their seats, some dozing off, others watching movies or scrolling through their phones. But Richard felt wide awake, as if something inside him had been jolted into consciousness. He turned to Keanu, gripping his glass a little tighter. "You lost people," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah." Richard hesitated, debating whether to press further. He wasn't used to these kinds of conversations, raw, unguarded. He was used to negotiating, outmaneuvering, making deals. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to say next. Keanu seemed to sense his hesitation. "I don't talk about it much," he admitted. "But yeah, I've lost a lot." He gazed out the window, his voice quieter now. "My dad left when I was a kid. My best friend died when we were young. I lost the woman I loved, and our daughter." Richard's grip on his glass faltered. He had read the headlines, of course, the gossip magazines, the tragic obituaries, the occasional deep-dive articles on Keanu Reeves. The Hollywood star who never lets fame change him, but he had never thought about what those losses meant. Not in real, human terms. Losing a child, losing the love of your life. Richard had built his empire on cold, calculated logic, on removing emotion from the equation. But this wasn't business. This was something else entirely. And somehow, despite all of it, Keanu still sat here, kind, patient, unshaken. Richard exhaled sharply, staring down at the bourbon he no longer wanted. "I don't get it," he muttered. Keanu turned to him. "What don't you get? How you keep going after that? How you don't just shut the world out?" Keanu was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because shutting the world out doesn't bring them back." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his gaze thoughtful. "Pain like that, it doesn't just go away. It stays with you. But you can choose what to do with it. You can let it harden you, or you can let it make you softer, more understanding. He glanced at Richard, his expression gentle. You get to decide. Richard let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. You make it sound easy. Keanu smiled, but there was a sadness in it. It's not. Richard ran a hand over his face. He could feel something shifting inside him, something uncomfortable, something unfamiliar. For years he had told himself that caring was a weakness, that the only thing that mattered was power. He had never allowed himself to feel anything beyond ambition and the occasional flash of triumph when he closed a deal. But now he felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at something vast and unknown. He thought about the people in his life, his business partners, his colleagues, the people he surrounded himself with. They were all just like him, ruthless, competitive, focused on winning. And yet, sitting next to Keanu, Richard suddenly realized that he couldn't name a single person in his life who would have spoken to him the way Keanu was now, not with judgment, not with condescension, just honesty. And maybe that was the problem. Richard swallowed hard. I don't think I know how to be different, he admitted. Keanu studied him for a long moment before responding. You don't have to change everything overnight. He tapped the armrest between them lightly. Just start with one thing. Richard frowned. Like what? Keanu smiled. Try being kind when you don't have to be. Richard scoffed. That's it? Keanu shrugged. It's harder than you think. Richard leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. Being kind when you don't have to be. He had spent his whole life doing the exact opposite. Every deal, every negotiation, every interaction was about winning. Even earlier, when he had insulted Keanu, it had been about asserting dominance, about proving his place. But what had it really gotten him? Respect? Maybe. Fear? Definitely. But admiration? Number? Not the kind of admiration Keanu had, the kind that wasn't about money or power, but about the way people felt around him, the kind that made a little boy light up just by receiving a signature, the kind that made a flight attendant linger a little longer just to share a moment of genuine appreciation. Richard had never known that kind of respect, and for the first time, he wanted it. The realization hit him so hard, he had to let out a slow breath, just to steady himself. He turned to Keanu, really looking at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Have you always been like this? He asked. Keanu chuckled. Number, I've made my share of mistakes. Richard smirked. Yeah? Name one. Keanu thought for a moment, then grinned. Turning down speed 2. Richard barked out a laugh, a real one, before he could stop himself. He shook his head. Yeah, that was probably a good call. Keanu smiled, then turned his gaze back to the clouds outside. Richard sat in silence, turning everything over in his mind. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had all the answers. He didn't feel like he had won. And yet, for some reason, it didn't feel like losing either. Maybe this wasn't about winning or losing at all. Maybe it was about something bigger than that. Richard set his untouched bourbon aside, exhaling slowly. Maybe it was time to start making different choices. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first one. The plane hummed steadily as it glided through the night sky. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. The world outside was a vast stretch of darkness, with only the occasional glimmer of distant cities below. But inside Richard, something was stirring, something bright, something uncertain, but undeniably alive. He had spent his entire life in control, dictating every move, every interaction, every outcome. But sitting here, beside a man he had once dismissed as unimportant, Richard felt like he was standing at the edge of something he didn't quite understand. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Keanu stretched slightly, letting out a small yawn before turning to Richard. Long flight, huh? Richard smirked. Yeah, feels longer than usual. Keanu chuckled. It happens when you're thinking about something new. Richard exhaled sharply. The guy really was some kind of sage. He glanced down at his hands, feeling the weight of his old self pressing against this new awareness. For years, he had been taught that people were either assets or obstacles, tools to be used or problems to be removed. He had built an empire on that principle, treating kindness like an unnecessary luxury. But now he couldn't stop thinking about what Keanu had said. Try being kind when you don't have to be. The phrase looped in his head like a song he couldn't turn off. Could it really be that simple? He had spent decades accumulating power, making sure no one could ever treat him the way he had treated Keanu at the start of this flight. But Keanu hadn't needed power. He hadn't needed to prove anything. And yet, he had commanded more respect in a single conversation than Richard had in an entire career. Not through intimidation, not through force, through character. Richard let out a breath and glanced around the cabin. The flight attendants moved quietly between the aisles, attending to passengers who were either asleep or lost in their movies. A few seats away, the young boy from earlier, Liam, was still clutching his signed notebook, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful slumber. Richard's gaze softened. That moment had been real. The way Keanu had spoken to the kid, the way he had seen him, not as a bother, not as a fan to be tolerated, but as a person. Richard had never thought about interactions that way before. He had always been too focused on what people could do for him. And now, for the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to do something for someone else. Not for leverage, not for strategy, but simply because it was the right thing to do. The thought unsettled him. And yet, beneath that discomfort, there was something else, something freeing. Keanu noticed his expression and smiled knowingly. It's weird, isn't it? Richard raised an eyebrow. What is? The moment you realize you don't have to be who you've always been. Richard huffed out a quiet laugh. You make it sound easy. Keanu shrugged. It's not, but it's possible. Richard was quiet for a long moment. He didn't want to admit how much those words affected him. But they did. The landing. As the plane began its descent, the cabin came to life with movement. Passengers stirred from their naps, seatbelts clicked into place, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the space. Richard watched as Keanu reached down to grab his bag, moving with a kind of ease. Richard envied. He had spent his whole life chasing power, and yet here was a man who had mastered something far greater. Peace. As they waited for the doors to open, Keanu turned to Richard and extended a hand. It was good talking to you, he said, his expression warm but expectant, as if waiting for something more. Richard hesitated, not because he didn't want to shake Keanu's hand, but because he felt, deep in his bones, that this was more than just a handshake. It was a choice, to continue being the man he had always been, or to try, just once, to be someone different. He took Keanu's hand. The grip was firm, steady, real, and somehow it meant more than any business deal he had ever made. As they stepped off the plane, Richard expected to feel the same sense of self-importance that usually followed him through first-class terminals. Instead, he felt something else. A kind of lightness. It wasn't transformation. It wasn't some grand epiphany that had suddenly turned him into a saint. But it was a start. The final lesson. As Richard walked toward the exit, he saw Liam and his mother struggling with their luggage. The boy was still clutching his notebook, eyes bleary from sleep. while his mother fumbled with a heavy carry-on. Richard hesitated. Normally, he would have walked past them, without a second thought. Helping wouldn't have benefited him. It wasn't his problem. But then Keanu's words whispered in his mind. Try being kind when you don't have to be. Before he could talk himself out of it, Richard stepped forward. Here, let me get that, he said, reaching for the bag. Liam's mother blinked in surprise. Oh, that's very kind of you. Richard waved it off, feeling uncomfortably awkward, but strangely good. As he lifted the bag with ease, Liam looked up at him, still groggy. Hey, you were sitting with Keanu Reeves. Richard smirked. Yeah, I was. Liam grinned. He's awesome. Richard nodded, then glanced over at the terminal, where Keanu was already blending into the crowd, moving with an effortless grace that Richard was only beginning to understand. Yeah, kid, he murmured. He really is. Liam smiled, clutching his notebook a little tighter. I want to be like him when I grow up. Richard looked at the boy, the innocent sincerity in his face, the unshaken belief that kindness mattered. And for the first time in his life, Richard thought, maybe I do too. As he handed the luggage to Liam's mother and watched them disappear into the airport, he realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next deal, his next move, or his next win. He was just here. And for now, that was enough.